The Grand Theft Auto Definitive Editions were a mixed bag. They largely controlled and played well, but the graphical overhaul they received was less than successful. Low-quality AI upscaled art was everywhere, model quality was often lacking, and updated characters awkwardly meshed with 20-year-old animation data. Players also often levied one key aesthetic criticism, that the remasters didn't align closely enough with the originals in terms of lighting and color, with a less stylized look. But that's all set to change with patch 6 for the definitive editions, which promises a new classic lighting mode in addition to a multitude of other fixes. So is this new lighting mode an improvement, and have any unexpected issues been introduced? The classic lighting option is a big improvement in my opinion. I think it effectively captures the spirit of the original games, especially in San Andreas. Notice how the light spills over this scene just like in the PS2's opening cutscene, with a similar lens flare effect. The sky captures the same smoggy gradient, and the distance fog is thick and dense relatively close to the camera. Late in the day, San Andreas is bathed in a kind of orange haze, as sunlight passes through a larger portion of the atmosphere. The same holds true once we get into gameplay, with a substantially closer match to the game's original look with the classic lighting in most conditions and areas. Regular lighting feels somewhat sterile in comparison. The classic lighting option also introduces other atmospheric effects, like the fog particles here, in certain weather conditions. San Andreas' original lighting wasn't exactly realistic, but it was designed to evoke a certain oppressive feel, to hide the limitations of the PS2, and to create the impression of a large scale. That last element is especially critical, because game environments, especially in older titles, are typically a lot smaller than the kinds of landscapes we're used to seeing in the real world. So you need those lighting effects to give you a greater impression of distance. When you turn on the regular lighting setup and strip away the ground haze effect, San Andreas can actually look pretty small. The classic lighting setup definitely helps here quite a bit. I didn't have as much time to explore the game's other cities, but the lighting presentation in those regions seemed fine as well, taking on a more neutral character in the desert surrounding Las Venturas, for instance. In GTA 3, the classic lighting often gives the game a darker look and sometimes imparts a bit of a blue or green tint. The opening cutscene is certainly much closer to the grading of that original sequence now, though other scenes sometimes show a less profound difference. In general, the classic lighting fits better with the original lighting presentation. If you look at the horizon line here, you can see another key change with the classic lighting, as the horizon is harder to distinguish as a fixed point. Instead, the haze softens the contrast between sky and water. This is arguably more realistic, though somewhat exaggerated. Haze is often more prominent close to the player in other areas too. GTA Vice City again proves a closer match to the original work, with a broadly similar palette in this opening cutscene. Gameplay also trends towards warmer hues, with a hazier atmosphere and a bright, bloomy sun. Relative to the PS2 original, the classic lighting usually matches key elements like the sky color, producing mellow oranges and faded pinks. Overall, I think the new classic lighting option works well and generally suits these three titles. San Andreas clearly gets the most comprehensive overhaul, with GTA 3 and Vice City receiving somewhat less impactful tweaks. A lot of time and attention seems to have gone into changing the lighting presentation so that each game feels more visually coherent and distinct from one another. We observed similar changes in the iPhone release from last year, but this is the first time we're seeing this mode on home consoles. The only real concession I spotted is the volumetric clouds, which were featured in the current gen console versions in fidelity mode, don't appear in the new classic lighting presentation. We get some simple 2D scrolling clouds instead. This probably won't matter for most players though, because the performance modes don't have volumetric clouds in either lighting configuration. But even the regular lighting has changed. When we compare patch 6 to patch 4, the last patch we looked at on home consoles, the lighting has been overhauled substantially. The biggest changes I spotted came in GTA 3. Note how much lighter this scene is now, and how the characters don't have that bizarre specular glow anymore. Some of these changes correct outstanding lighting problems, while others, like the tweaked lamp-like color here, seem more purely aesthetic. It looks like developer Video Games Deluxe, taking over from original dev Grove Street Games, has made a wide range of tweaks in this patch to the lighting presentation that apply to both lighting modes. There are, however, some visual issues with patch 6, some of them seemingly new as of this release. In San Andreas, there's a bit of a curious issue with low detail variants of the terrain, as they don't perfectly align. That means that distant views sometimes reveal sharp, black, unrendered holes, which only give way to reasonable looking terrain when the player draws near. This problem has been present in San Andreas since launch, but it's more obvious in this patch, in part because these seams are popping up more frequently for some reason, even from the same vantage point. Also, sometimes the seams aren't affected properly by the lighting now, so they are pure black and really stand out. I also encountered an odd lighting issue with the headlights of the player car, which you can see in this scene. They cast sharply defined light across the environment, which doesn't align with how real lights soften and diffuse. It doesn't matter whether I'm using classic lighting or not, as the issue remains. Interestingly, when I get inside a car, notice how the spill from the headlights changes from a pretty accurate looking lighting presentation to a relatively harsh one. NPC cars and unoccupied cars then are not affected by this issue. If we go back to patch 4, the same issue isn't present at all. Notice how the headlights here smoothly spill over the environment, while in patch 6, the light has a perfectly crisp silhouette. Patch 6 also revises the fire effects, and I do think the results are generally more compelling. The fire isn't oddly dim anymore, has higher resolution flames, and casts more light onto the surrounding environment. Generally speaking, the new fire is clearly visible and easy to read, which wasn't always the case before. I did notice one substantial issue here though. My helicopter is technically on fire here and is about to explode, but it's pretty tough to actually notice because the fire sprite only appears intermittently and it doesn't even track with my aircraft. It sort of looks like the helicopter is dropping flares for 10 seconds or so and then suddenly explodes. If we go back to earlier patches, the fire spawned more frequently and it effectively communicated that you were in imminent danger. And vehicles don't really start smoking until they are on the verge of explosion, which makes it hard to tell if you've suffered damage, though this is not really a new issue. Finally, a lot of the other issues that we've raised during our GTA Definitive Edition coverage haven't been fixed. To be fair, some of the spelling errors have finally been addressed. Note how bare boxes is finally gearboxes, but there are instances, like with this Salvadorian sign, where the text remains incorrect. The GTA Definitive Editions still make heavy use of AI upscaled artwork, and the results are generally poor. There's sort of an impression of higher detail art, but the results are laden with harsh upscaling artifacts. Text in particular gets mangled quite substantially. Tiny looks like my here, for instance. These really should have been redrawn, or perhaps replaced with higher res original Xbox textures when available. More sophisticated AI art upscaling exists now as well, so that older work could be brought up closer to modern standards without necessarily requiring a lot of extra effort. The redrawn art usually doesn't look that great either. Notice how blank and featureless this building is, or how these building faces suffer from obvious repeated patterns from texture tiling. The textures just don't look good in context here at all, and you don't see nearly enough variation. The fact that buildings generally use the same geometry as their PS2 forebears doesn't help either, lending most structures a boxy angular look. There are also alignment issues with bits of ground clutter, like the leaves here, or foliage elements with this grass on Vice Beach. That's nothing new at all, but it is kind of remarkable that this hasn't been fixed. 6 patches in, and over 3 years after the original release. There are a ton of other fixes here, mostly gameplay related, and a lot of art tweaks that I don't have time to list, like the revised logos on the police here, or the new frost particles in the Vice City opening cutscene here. but from a visual perspective, I think I've gone over the key changes and issues. As a final note here, I did a quick checkup on performance in patch 6 across the current gen consoles. Fortunately, I can report that the frame pacing issue that has affected the definitive editions for a very long time now has been resolved as of patch 6, with 0 frame time wobbles in fidelity mode on any current gen console. That makes the fidelity modes an essentially locked 30 FPS on all tested consoles. The performance modes are generally a solid 60 FPS, with a typically unblemished update during normal gameplay. Hopping into a tank and causing mayhem can lead to some minor framerate drops though, which seemed to hit the two Xbox consoles a little harder than the PS5. These are just little 33 ms blips here, which coincide with on-screen pyrotechnics. But Sony's new PS5 Pro generally seems unfazed even in these circumstances, and didn't drop frames in performance mode in my testing. I don't believe the game has formal PS5 Pro support though. This is likely just the PS5 code running boosted. The Grand Theft Auto Definitive Editions must have had a complicated development and patching cycle. It's highly unusual to see so many visual fixes deployed to a game post-release, with such a huge impact on the way the game appears. Glaring issues with the artwork remain, however, as well as problems with the game's lighting. That probably speaks to some potential underlying technical issues, and perhaps some production friction as well between the various development and oversight entities that have had their hands on these games. I think the crux of the problem though comes down to scope. Remastering 3 large PS2 era titles within Unreal Engine is a tall order, and the decision to rely so heavily on the basic art and animation from those games while attempting to achieve a modern visual look was never going to produce a consistently great result. A more comprehensive remake effort could have produced a much more satisfying outcome. That would of course likely have required a larger budget and would probably be better suited to tackling a single game at a time. Still, there's a lot that could have been done to improve these games, and still should be done. A lot of the visual issues I've discussed today should be resolvable with a reasonable patching effort. And there are a wide range of gameplay issues that also need to be addressed, particularly in the latter stages in San Andreas, including problems with minigames and flying. That said, I think the Definitive Edition versions are probably the best way to play the older GTA games right now, if only because they run at a reasonably good update and have modern controls that will feel comfortable to most players. The Unreal Engine 4 driven graphics can look okay enough at times too, as long as you don't look at anything too closely. So the Definitive Editions still aren't at the quality bar that a major game studio should reach for a remaster or remake. Series fans deserve better, but these are perhaps the best options to play these titles in 2024. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.